A widow and her 3 children were being sold in the marketplace of San Rio, beneath the crack of whips and the cruel laughter of men. In a world where people were measured by money, one man stepped forward, not a rich man, not a powerful one, just a poor cowboy, holding half of an old silver necklace, the only thing left from his mother. Stay with me for just one more minute, and I'll tell you the story that made an entire square fall silent, where a single piece of silver rekindled the hope of freedom for them all. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if stories like this still make your heart tremble, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next light that flickers through the dark. May you never stop believing in kindness, no matter how cold the world becomes. Under the burning sun of San Rio, the air was thick with dust and the smell of sweat and horses. The square trembled with noise, men shouting, coins clinking, and cattle pushing through the crowd like restless ghosts of the open range. It was the kind of afternoon when even the wind felt cruel, when heat made tempers short and mercy shorter. Flies circled the faces of men who had long forgotten gentleness, and above them the courthouse bell hung still, as if unwilling to strike witness to what was about to unfold. On a raised wooden platform stood Clara Mayfield, 28, maybe less, too young for the word widow, too proud for the place she'd been forced to stand. Her dark hair, once pinned neatly, now clung to her temples in damp strands. Her dress, the color of old lilac, had been mended too many times to hide the wear. Beside her clung 3 children, the oldest, a boy of 8, with dust on his cheeks and eyes too tired for his years. A little girl with tangled blonde curls clutching a frayed rag doll, and a baby sleeping in the crook of her mother's arm, oblivious to the bargain forming around them. The auctioneer, a thin man in a sweat-stained vest, wiped his brow and called for silence. His voice cracked, half from heat, half from discomfort, but duty was duty in San Rio. By order of debt owed to Mr. Eli Barman, he said, the widow Mayfield and her household belongings. He hesitated on that word, as if belongings could include breathing souls, shall be sold to settle what remains unpaid. A murmur rippled through the square. Some men looked away, others smirked. Women at the edges of the crowd held baskets close, whispering to each other but not stepping forward. San Rio had seen many things: cattle rustlers, shootouts, broken treaties, but the sight of a woman and her children being priced like mules still turned a few stomachs. Yet no one spoke. From the shade of the saloon porch, Eli Barman watched it all with the satisfaction of a man who believed he owned more than land. He was broad-shouldered, his mustache trimmed sharp, his white shirt too clean for this dust-choked town. In one hand he held a ledger, in the other a silver-tipped cane. $1,000, he barked, his voice carrying over the square. That's what she owes. That's what she's worth. Clara's breath hitched. She stepped forward, trembling, clutching her children tighter. Please, she said softly, voice hoarse from days without rest. Give me time. I can work. I can pay. Her words were cut short by a laugh. Eli's, low and mean. You'll pay nothing without a man to own you. Then, in front of the whole town, he lifted his boot and struck her side. Not hard enough to kill, but enough to silence. The baby woke, crying. The crowd did not. For a moment, the noise that filled San Rio stilled. Even the cattle seemed to pause. The auctioneer swallowed hard and looked away. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then went quiet. From that quiet came the scrape of spurs against the wooden boards. A man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Jonas Hale, though few there knew his name, moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime walking against wind and gunfire. He was tall, perhaps in his 40s, with a face carved by sun and solitude. His beard was peppered with gray, his eyes the color of dry river stone. The brim of his hat cast a shadow that made his expression unreadable. His coat was worn but clean, his boots dusted with miles of road behind him. He said nothing at first, just reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small pouch. From it, he placed upon the table a silver necklace, dull with age but still gleaming faintly in the sunlight. The delicate chain held a locket etched with faded initials, M.H., and the sight of it drew a few whispers. "This once belonged to my mother," he said, his voice low, steady, and raw like a hymn sung by someone who'd buried too much. "It'll buy her freedom until I bring the rest." Eli, barman, looked from the necklace to the man, then to the widow on the platform. His lip curled. "You think trinkets pay debts?" Jonas's gaze didn't waver. "It's silver, pure, and there's more coming." "You have my word." The rancher scoffed. "Your word. I deal in coin, not promises." The crowd stirred again, restless, torn between curiosity and shame. Some men shifted hats. Others muttered, sensing that something beyond trade was taking shape here. Clara, still kneeling, looked up at the stranger. The sun caught on the chain he'd offered, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something that wasn't cruelty. It was reverence. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The auctioneer, uncertain, looked from Eli to Jonas. It's fair silver, sir," he stammered. "Worth near half the debt, at least." Eli's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Half? She's not half a woman, is she?" The cruelty of it sliced the air like a whip, but Jonas didn't flinch. Instead, he took one slow step closer until the dust stirred around his boots. "You're right," he said quietly. "She's whole, and I'll pay the rest when I can." Something in the man's tone, measured, unshaken, cut deeper than anger could. Even the laughter that followed sounded uncertain. Eli stared at him for a long moment, then down at the necklace. Finally, with a small, disdainful grunt, he nodded to the auctioneer. "Fine," he said. "Take it. But if he doesn't bring the rest within a month, I'll collect twice over." The papers were signed in silence. Jonas didn't look at Eli again. He only gathered the documents, then turned toward Clara. His eyes softened. "Come," he said simply. Not an order, not even a request, just a bridge offered to someone drowning. Clara hesitated. Her children pressed against her skirts. The boy met Jonas's gaze first. There was something in it. Tired, maybe, but kind. The kind of kindness that doesn't ask to be noticed. Slowly, she rose. As they stepped down from the platform, the crowd parted. Dust swirled around their feet, the air still heavy with what had been witnessed. People looked away, pretending to study the ground, ashamed not of what had been done, but that it took a stranger to undo it. Jonas paused beside the auction table, the space between him and Eli thick with unspoken history. Then, without another word, he tipped his hat and led the widow and her children toward a waiting wagon at the edge of town. The baby had stopped crying. The little girl clutched her mother's hand, whispering something about the pretty necklace. Clara said nothing. Her voice, like her faith, had been battered thin. But when she turned back once, just once, she caught the faint glint of that silver in Jonas's hand and felt for the first time in months the smallest flicker of warmth in her chest. As they left San Rio, the sun began to dip behind the hills, bleeding red into the dust. The town returned to its noise, to its barter and its pride. But for a breath, the world had remembered what mercy sounded like. And though no one said it aloud, every soul that stood in that square knew they had witnessed something holy, not from heaven, but from a man who still believed in it. For a moment, mercy had a face. The road out of San Rio stretched like a scar across the land, long, crooked, and silent, except for the creak of wooden wheels dragging over stones. Evening light bled across the valley, staining the sky a weary copper, and every turn of the wagon's axle seemed to echo the exhaustion of souls who had seen too much for one day. Jonas sat tall at the reins, his hat brim low against the dying sun, saying nothing as the horses snorted in the cooling air. Behind him, Clara huddled in the wagon bed, her children wrapped in a faded quilt that smelled faintly of flour and rain. Each jolt in the rutted road reminded her of the bargain struck. A woman once sold, now being taken somewhere she did not yet understand. The valley deepened as they descended into the shadows of the pines. The wind changed, carrying the scent of resin and wet soil, and the sound of running water murmured somewhere ahead. Silver Creek, perhaps. The baby stirred, whimpering softly before sinking back into uneasy sleep. The boy, Henry, leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, eyes half closed, while little Ruth whispered to her doll, asking whether the man on the wagon seat was an angel or another kind of storm. Clara couldn't answer. Her heart was too full of questions she had stopped daring to ask. When the horses finally slowed, she saw it. A small cabin crouched beside the creek, its roof patched with cedar shingles and its chimney breathing a thin thread of smoke. The fence around it was broken in places, the porch sagged, and yet there was something unexplainably gentle in the way it stood, like a hand still open after years of work. Jonas drew the reins tight and spoke softly to the horses, his voice carrying the steady calm of someone who had learned to live with silence. He climbed down, motioned toward the door. "You can go inside," he said simply. Clara didn't move. Kindness was never free, and she had learned that mercy too often came wrapped in expectation. The last man who had offered her shelter had also offered her shame. Her arms tightened around the children as she waited for the unspoken price. But it didn't come. Instead, Jonas disappeared behind the wagon, returned with a tin cup filled from his canteen, and handed it to her. "Water's clean," he murmured. Then, pointing toward the stove through the half-open door, he added, "You and the little ones sleep inside. I'll take the barn." The words struck her harder than cruelty ever had. She stared at him, half disbelieving. The lines on his face caught the lantern light, hard but not unkind. He waited a moment, perhaps expecting protest, then nodded once and walked away toward the barn, his boots whispering against the pine needles. The sound faded, leaving only the murmur of the creek and the restless sigh of wind in the branches. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and pine pitch. A rough table stood near the hearth, its surface scarred, but polished by years of use. On the wall hung a single coat, patched and neatly folded. Beside it, a small horseshoe nailed for luck. Clara set the baby on a pile of blankets, coaxed the others to sleep, and sat by the window. Through the wavering glass, she could see the barn, dim light from a lantern flickering faintly within. She heard no movement, no voice, no footstep that hinted at demand. All night, she lay awake. The silence of the cabin felt strange, almost heavy. Not the silence of threat, but of waiting. The creek outside kept time with her heartbeat, soft and endless. At one point, she thought she heard him cough, a single rough sound, and then nothing but the shifting of the wind. She wondered what kind of man traded silver not for ownership, but for peace. She wondered what ghosts he carried in his sleep. When dawn came, it arrived quietly, sliding gold over the ridge and spilling into the valley like forgiveness. Clara rose, wrapped the baby, and stepped outside. The air was sharp with dew, and the pines shimmered faintly with morning light. She found Jonas by the fence line, sleeves rolled, hands rough and sure, as he repaired the sagging rails. His coat lay draped over a post, his shirt damp with work, his hair silvered with frost. He didn't see her at first, or pretended not to. When he finally glanced up, his expression held the same calm as the night before, as if nothing remarkable had passed between them. "You don't have to," she said softly, nodding toward the fence. He tightened a knot in the rope, testing its strength. "Someone should," he answered, and returned to work. There was no sermon in his tone, no judgment, only the plain rhythm of a man who fixed what was broken because it was there to be fixed. Clara stood a moment longer, her breath visible in the chill air, then turned back toward the cabin. The children were stirring, small sounds of waking innocence that filled the room with something dangerously close to comfort. Later, she found a tin pail by the door, full of fresh creek water, and a small loaf of bread left on the table, coarse, uneven, but warm. She touched it lightly, almost afraid to believe it was meant for her. The baby smiled in sleep, and for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to sit without trembling. Through the window, Jonas moved among the pines, checking the horses, brushing dust from their coats, speaking to them in a voice too low to catch. His gestures were slow, deliberate, like prayer. Clara watched him until her vision blurred with unshed tears. She didn't know why she felt safer now than she had in months, nor why that safety frightened her even more than danger had. Perhaps because it asked her to trust again, to remember that not all men came to take. That night, after the children slept, she stepped onto the porch. The moon was rising over Silver Creek, white and thin, turning the water to glass. From the barn drifted the faint sound of a harmonica, a melody fragile as memory. She leaned against the post, listening. It wasn't a song she knew, but it carried the ache of distant fields, of mothers long gone, of promises that never found their way home. She stayed until the tune faded into the hush of the forest. Then she whispered to the wind, though no one heard, "Thank you." Inside, she lay beside her children. For once, the darkness felt less like a cage and more like a blanket. Sleep came slowly, threaded with dreams of hands that mended instead of broke, of fences rebuilt, of voices that didn't demand but offered. When the first light of dawn brushed against the window again, Clara woke with the strangest feeling. Not fear, not sorrow, but something new, delicate as a seed in thawing ground. Hope, and it terrified her, because hope meant she might have something left to lose. By mid-spring, Silver Creek shimmered like a mirror, the valley dressed again in green after the long thaw. The pines swayed softly, their needles whispering a lullaby only the wind could hear, and the air carried the scent of damp soil and new life. Around the cabin, everything seemed touched by renewal, everything except the quiet inside, where gratitude had taken the shape of silence and trust had yet to learn its name. Clara moved through the rooms with careful grace, setting bread to rise, mending small shirts, sweeping the dust that always returned no matter how she tried, and every so often she'd glance toward the fields where Jonas worked. Not out of fear, not quite yet of affection, but of a feeling between the two she could neither name nor deny. The children had begun to laugh again. They followed Jonas like small shadows, their voices lifting into the air calling him Uncle Jonas. He never seemed used to the title. His lips twitched as though the word caught on old sorrow, yet he never corrected them. He built them a small stool to reach the basin, patched the roof that had wept through winter, and left small surprises on the table when no one watched. A wooden comb carved smooth as river stones, socks knitted too neatly to have come from his hands, a little box marked with their initials that smelled faintly of cedar. Clara would find them in the mornings and touch each one as if unsure whether to smile or weep. One evening, as dusk fell thick and gold over the hills, the air turned restless. The horses in the pen pawed the ground, uneasy, and thunder began to mutter beyond the ridge. Jonas paused at the fence line, squinting toward the horizon, his posture tense, listening to something only men who had lived through storms could hear. Inside, Clara gathered the children, closing the shutters, laying another log on the fire. The sky darkened fast, the color of bruised steel. The smell of rain crept through the cracks in the wood. Then came the flash, white and sudden, clawing across the hills like a living thing. The crash followed, shaking the glass in the windows. Ruth screamed and hid beneath the table. The baby began to cry. Jonas came in soaked to the shoulders, rain streaming off his hat. "Stay away from the chimney," he said quickly, his voice calm but firm. He moved with quiet precision, checking the latch, shifting the bucket under the leak, eyes scanning each corner as if he could somehow hold back the storm itself. But there are storms no man can command. Later that night, Henry began to shiver. His forehead burned under Clara's trembling hand. She whispered his name, shook him gently, but his eyelids fluttered without focus. Panic tightened her chest. She had nothing. No medicine, no doctor within half a day's ride. Her lips moved in prayer, the kind of desperate pleading that needs no words. Jonas was already reaching for his coat. "Where are you going?" she asked, voice breaking. "Down the ridge," he said. "Old creek bed. There's a fever there. It's pouring. You'll drown out there." But the door had already opened, and the storm swallowed him whole. The hours that followed stretched endlessly. Rain pounded the roof like angry fists, wind screaming through the cracks, and every few minutes the lightning returned, white and merciless. Clara sat by the bed, sponging Henry's face with cold water, whispering, "Stay, my boy, stay with me." His skin burned hotter. Ruth whimpered in her sleep beside the hearth, clutching her doll. The baby coughed, stirred, then fell still again. She tried to pray, but her mind was a blur of fear and memory. Every man who had promised to help, every kindness that had turned to cruelty. Then, sometime near dawn, the door burst open. Jonas stumbled in, drenched to the bone, his hands shaking around a bundle wrapped in his scarf. Mud streaked his face, his eyes hollow but alive. "Boil these," he rasped, dropping the bundle on the table. Inside were roots, bitter-smelling and pale as bone. "Cut small, in water, not too long." Together they worked. The fire hissed as wet herbs met the boiling pot. The room filled with steam and the scent of earth and rain. Jonas wrung his coat, his shoulders trembling with exhaustion, but his voice never rose above a whisper. Clara pressed cloths to Henry's skin, spooned the bitter tea to his lips, counted breaths between each swallow. Outside, the storm raged, a furious heartbeat matching her own. Hours passed without measure, the kind of hours that carved themselves into the memory of those who survived them. When the thunder finally began to fade, Henry stirred. His breathing slowed, the fever breaking like ice under the sun. Clara froze, her hand still on his brow, hardly daring to believe. Jonas sat slumped against the wall, eyes closed, water dripping from his hair onto the floor. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the fire crackled, small and steady, as if afraid to disturb the peace it had helped earn. Clara turned toward him then, truly seeing him for the first time. The deep lines around his mouth, the scars along his forearm, the way his hands still trembled, though the danger had passed. "You went into the storm for us," she said softly. He opened his eyes, met hers. "You would have done the same," he answered, though his voice broke halfway through. And maybe that was true, but the truth in her heart was simpler. No one ever had. As dawn crept across the valley, the world outside was reborn. Water dripped from the eaves in silver threads. The sky blushed pale pink behind the hills. Inside, Henry slept, his fever gone, his breathing steady. Clara brushed damp hair from his forehead, then looked again at Jonas, soaked, shivering, but alive. Something unspoken passed between them, something that asked for no reward, no explanation. He hadn't bought her. He hadn't even tried. He had freed her from the weight of fearing goodness, from the belief that kindness was a mask. And in that freedom, she felt something tremble awake inside her. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, a different one had just begun. One born not of thunder, but of the slow, aching rediscovery of trust. Spring deepened, and with it came a strange stillness, the kind that hovers before a storm, when even birds grow quiet, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The days were longer now, and the valley shimmered with color, wildflowers pushing through the thawed earth, Silver Creek singing again as it rushed over smooth stones. Yet within that beauty, an unease began to stir, invisible, like smoke beneath sunlight. Jonas sensed it first. He'd grown accustomed to silence, but this silence was different, heavier, as though the world were waiting for something cruel to arrive. The rumors reached town before the flowers had fully bloomed. They moved from lips to whiskey glasses, from saloon to feed store, whispered by men who found comfort in suspicion. They said Jonas Hale had cheated Eli Barman, that the silver he'd paid was worthless, that the so-called widow and her brats were living on land that wasn't rightfully his. And men like Eli, proud, cruel, and rich enough to believe the law was an extension of their will, didn't take kindly to being made fools. By the time the gossip reached the foot of Silver Creek, it had teeth. That afternoon, as sunlight bent low through the pine trees, a stranger rode up the dirt road. His horse was black and thin, the kind that had seen too many miles and too little kindness. The man who rode it introduced himself as Travis Finch, somewhere in his 30s with hair slicked back by dust and sweat and a smile too sharp to be trusted. His eyes, gray and fractured like broken glass, missed nothing. He wore a long brown duster, the hem frayed, and his boots carried the red clay of distant places. When he dismounted, he tipped his hat low, voice smooth as honey left too long in the sun. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Heard there's a man here buys freedom with trinkets. I deal in trinkets myself. Silver, mostly." Clara stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other gripping the edge of her apron. The children were inside, their laughter fading into uneasy whispers. Jonas was out by the stream, mending a fence rail. She forced a polite smile. "We don't trade much here," she said, her voice thin. The man's eyes slid past her shoulder, scanning the dim interior of the cabin. "Shame," he murmured. "Pretty place, quiet, almost too quiet. His smile widened, revealing teeth yellowed by tobacco. "Maybe I'll come back when your man's around." She nodded stiffly, shutting the door before he could say more. Her hands trembled as the latch clicked into place. For several moments she stood there, listening to the receding sound of hooves, to the wind rustling the pines, to her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She didn't tell Jonas that night, not yet. Some instinct, old as fear itself, told her to wait. But waiting never stops what's meant to find you. That night, the moon rose pale over the ridge, veiled in thin clouds. The cabin slept uneasily. The fire had gone to embers, and Clara lay awake, sensing something just beyond the walls, a presence too real to be imagined. Then came the faint creak of wood outside, the crunch of gravel under a slow, deliberate step. She rose quietly, every nerve alive, and looked through the curtain. There was nothing, only the outline of the barn, black against the silver field. Yet for the briefest moment she thought she saw movement, a shadow slipping behind the fence, dissolving into the dark. By morning, the light came brittle and cold. Jonas stepped onto the porch to fetch water and stopped. Buried deep into the porch post was a knife, its blade sunk halfway into the grain, the handle carved from bleached bone, the surface etched with a crude X. A message that needed no words. He stared at it for a long time, then pulled it free, turning the weight of it in his hand. The metal was still cold, as if the night had left part of itself behind. Clara stood at the doorway, pale, her arms crossed over her chest. "Jonas," she whispered. He said nothing, only walked back inside, the knife glinting in his grasp, and crossed to the far corner where a weathered trunk sat beneath the window, the one he'd never opened, the one that had gathered dust since the day they came here. Without a word, he lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded blue coat, the color faded with age, its brass buttons dulled but intact. Beneath it, wrapped in oilskin, rested a long rifle, polished, heavy, silent. Clara's breath caught. "I thought you didn't keep guns," she said quietly. Jonas ran a calloused hand over the rifle's barrel, the motion tender, almost reverent. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "I used to carry it to kill," he said. "Now I carry it to protect." There was no pride in his tone, only memory, the kind that still hurt to speak aloud. He placed the coat beside him, tracing the insignia with one finger, a faded Union star, edges frayed from years of wear. The fabric smelled faintly of smoke and iron and rain. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold two worlds, the quiet life they'd built and the one he'd left behind. Clara watched him, realizing suddenly that his silence had never been emptiness. But wait, the weight of a man who'd seen how easily mercy could be mistaken for weakness. He looked up then, meeting her eyes. "Men like Barman don't forget," he said. "And men like Finch don't come alone." Clara stepped closer, voice trembling. "What do we do?" Jonas stood, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "We keep living," he said simply. Then, softer, "We keep watch." All that day, the air carried a strange stillness again, the horses restless in their pen, the creek running faster as if hurrying toward something it couldn't avoid. By evening, clouds had gathered over the valley, heavy and gray, mirroring the weight in Clara's chest. She watched Jonas on the porch, cleaning the rifle with steady hands, the Union coat folded neatly beside him. The children played near the hearth, unaware that safety could vanish as quietly as morning mist. When the sun dipped and the first star appeared, Jonas paused, his gaze fixed on the far line of pines where the road bent toward San Rio. The rifle caught the last shard of daylight, gleaming like truth laid bare. He didn't move, didn't speak, but in that silence, Clara felt it. The past had found them again, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who had run out of places to hide, that peace was never a gift. It was a promise you had to guard. The morning broke cold and colorless, the kind that carries no promise, only purpose. Before the first light touched the ridges, Jonas saddled the bay mare and packed a small bundle behind the saddle. He didn't leave a note, didn't wake Clara or the children. He only whispered to the sleeping dawn, 2 days. As though saying it aloud might make it true, the sound of the horse's hooves faded down the trail, swallowed by the hush of pines and the slow turning of the earth. He rode without hurry, the way men ride when the journey is heavier than the destination. Mist rose from Silver Creek, curling like smoke over the fields. The valley that had once felt like sanctuary now seemed to hold its breath again, watching him go. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of rain and memory. Every ridge he crossed brought him closer to the place he had once walked away from, the town where cruelty dressed as law and laughter could wound deeper than bullets. San Rio never forgot, but men like Eli Barman knew how to keep memories alive for profit. In the weeks after Jonas vanished, Eli turned the town against him. He told anyone who'd listen that Jonas Hale had tricked him, that the necklace was a fraud, that the silver he paid was stolen, that the man who played the hero was nothing more than a coward hiding behind a widow's skirts. He told the story over whiskey, reshaping truth into something uglier with every retelling, and the crowd, hungry for gossip and guiltless of compassion, listened. Soon, Jonas's name became a stain on every tongue, proof that decency was a fool's disguise. But out beyond the valley, in a place where the earth still smelled of gunpowder and rain, Jonas dug beneath an old cedar stone. The soil was cold, packed with roots and years. Beneath it lay a bundle wrapped in oilskin, the last of his war pay, silver bars darkened by time, and something else smaller, wrapped inside a soldier's handkerchief. It was the dog tag of a friend long gone, the man who once said, "If you ever live long enough to make things right, promise me you will." Jonas had kept that promise buried for too long. Now, with the lies crawling through San Rio like snakes, he knew what it was meant for. He didn't dig for wealth, he dug for his word, for the last piece of honor that still tethered him to the man he used to be. When he rose from the dirt, hands bleeding, he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was simply a man carrying the weight of what was owed, not to Eli, not to Clara, but to his own conscience. San Rio appeared at the far end of the plain, crouched beneath a sky of pewter. Its streets were the same, dust-choked, restless, the kind that never forgot a face. Jonas tied his horse by the hitching post outside the saloon, brushed the trail dust from his coat, and stepped inside. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the low murmur of men spending the day wasting their lives. Cards slapped wood. Whiskey glasses clinked. But when Jonas Hale entered, the sound thinned, as if the room itself had drawn in a breath it didn't mean to hold. Eli Barman sat at the far table beneath the window, his ledger open beside a half-finished drink. He hadn't changed much, broad, smug, with the kind of wealth that dulls the eyes. Two men flanked him, one cleaning his nails with a knife, the other tapping a match against the table edge. When Jonas approached, Eli looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "look what the river washed back." Jonas didn't answer. He laid a small bundle on the table and unwrapped the oilskin. Inside, dull silver bars caught the light, not polished, not new, but clean. "For the necklace," he said quietly, "and for her freedom. Fully." His voice carried no tremor, only finality. Eli leaned back, took a sip of whiskey, and let the silence stretch. "You kept it all this time," he said. "War pay, wasn't it? Thought that was buried for good." "It was," Jonas replied, "under a cedar stone where the dead can't find it." A few men at nearby tables shifted, listening. The room had gone still. The only sound was the wind outside, rattling the signboard like a warning. Eli set his glass down slowly. "And you think that pile of tarnish settles it?" he asked, voice low and thick with disdain. "You cheated me, Hale. Half a deal's no deal. The whole town knows it." Jonas met his eyes, steady, unblinking. "No," he said. "You cheated yourself when you forgot that mercy's worth more than gold." The knife stopped tapping. The match stopped flicking. Something heavy moved through the room, invisible but felt. Eli's lips twisted. "You think you can come in here preaching after paying with scraps?" Jonas straightened, his shadow long across the floorboards. "You can't buy honor, Eli," he said. "But I just paid for my soul." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Eli laughed, short, sharp, though his voice cracked halfway through. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver necklace, and tossed it across the table. It slid once, spinning, before settling at the edge of Jonas's hand. "Take your trinket," Eli said. "You'll need something to remember your foolishness by." Jonas caught it easily, the chain coiling in his palm like a memory returned home. He didn't look at Eli again, didn't look at the men or the faces watching from the shadows. He turned, pushed open the swinging doors, and stepped back into the light. The sun had broken through the clouds at last, thin but certain. Dust rose around his boots as he crossed the street to where his horse waited. He paused only once to wrap the necklace around his fingers, its weight no longer debt, but release. Behind him, the saloon remained silent. No laughter followed, no jeers, no gunfire. Just quiet, the kind that lingers when men see something they can't mock because it's too close to truth. Jonas mounted the mare and guided her toward the road that led out of town. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of church bells from somewhere distant. Not for him, not for anyone in particular, but enough to remind him that redemption never shouts. It whispers. The necklace glinted once in the light before he tucked it safely into his coat. He rode slow through the valley, passing the same hills that had once been stained with war and greed. Now they were green again, soft and forgiving. When he reached the ridge above Silver Creek, he stopped for a moment, looking down at the cabin in the pines. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and blue. He could almost hear Clara's voice calling the children, the sound of laughter carried by the wind. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt the quiet inside him. No debts left to pay, no ghosts left to answer, no chains still dragging through memory. The past no longer pursued him. It had been met, spoken to, and laid to rest. What remained was something lighter than forgiveness, stronger than pride. The peace that comes when a man finally does what is right, not to be remembered, but to be free. And so he rode on, not toward victory, not toward forgiveness, but toward peace, the rarest treasure a man can ever own. By the time summer reached Silver Creek, the valley had softened into 1,000 shades of green. The wind no longer carried dust or memory, only the scent of rain and lavender that grew wild along the porch rail. The cabin that once echoed with silence now hummed with small laughter, the kind that spills out of children unafraid of tomorrow. The dog lay by the steps, paws twitching in dream, its fur catching the sunlight like ripples of gold. Somewhere beyond the meadow, Jonas's hammer struck once, twice, the rhythm of a man fixing something, not because it was broken, but because it finally mattered again. Days in the valley no longer began with fear or ended in counting what was lost. They began with Clara's voice reading softly from her journal. Words not for history, but for healing. She often wrote beneath the porch, her back to the morning sun, the silver necklace resting in her palm. Sometimes she would pause, letting her fingers trace its curve as if to remind herself that freedom, once bought in sorrow, could still bloom in peace. The pages she filled were simple, notes about the weather, the garden, the children. Yet every line carried something weightier. Gratitude written by a heart that had learned the cost of mercy. Jonas watched her from the field that afternoon, sleeves rolled, his old patched coat catching the breeze. He had aged softly since the day he rode back from San Rio. Not older, just quieter. There was something in his eyes that had let go of war, of debt, of ghosts. Clara turned, smiling, a small crease of sunlight caught in her hair. She still wore that same faded blue dress, threadbare at the hem, gentle at the shoulders, the one she'd worn the first day he found her among the lavender and fear. To anyone else, it was just an old dress, but to Jonas, it was the first color of hope he had seen after years of gray. He walked to her slowly, boots sinking in soft earth, each step measured like a prayer. Around them, the fields rolled in quiet motion, wheat bowing to wind, bees working the wildflowers. The children darted through the tall grass, their laughter ringing like church bells across the meadow. There was no crowd, no witness, no promise beyond the one they carried in their hearts. The dog barked at a drifting butterfly, then lay down again, tail thudding lazily. Jonas stopped beside Clara, sunlight washing their faces in equal gold. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that something sacred was about to be said. Then Jonas reached into his coat and drew out the necklace. The silver had dulled with age, but its shape was true, a circle unbroken, like forgiveness itself. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "This was my mother's," he said. "I gave it once to save you. Now I give it again, because I choose you." He lifted her wrist gently, the way one might lift something fragile and irreplaceable. The chain clicked softly as he fastened it, and in that quiet sound there was a kind of vow that didn't need words. It fit her perfectly, as though it had always been waiting to rest there, a mark not of ownership, but of choice. Clara's eyes glimmered, not with tears, but with the calm shine of understanding. "You already did," she whispered, "the day you came back." The wind carried their silence outward, across the field and into the hills. The children spun around them, chasing dandelions and laughter. Above, a hawk circled lazily in the sky, as if keeping watch. Jonas looked up, squinting at the sun, then back at the woman before him. There were no more words left to trade, only peace, and the quiet knowing that life, at last, had turned gentle. Later that evening, the sky blushed with the color of cooling embers. Clara lit a small lantern by the porch, more out of habit than need, and they sat together on the steps as the children fell asleep inside. The necklace gleamed faintly in the light, catching each breath of wind like it remembered the road that had brought it home. Jonas leaned back, gazing toward the horizon where the fields met the mountains. "Funny," he murmured, "how something given away can find its way back." Clara smiled, folding her hand over his. "Maybe it never left," she said. "Maybe it was just waiting for us to stop running." He nodded, the faintest smile tracing his lips. The night gathered around them. Crickets, fireflies, the soft rustle of wheat, all of it singing the same quiet hymn of belonging. There was no priest, no witness, no law to name what they had built together, and yet it felt as binding as any vow written in Scripture. In a land that once sold people like cattle, two souls had proven that love could never be bought, only chosen and only kept through kindness. As darkness settled, the valley glowed with a hush that was neither sadness nor joy, but something deeper, contentment, the kind that doesn't shout or demand to be seen, but lingers in the way light touches wood, or how a laugh echoes after it's gone. Jonas watched the lantern sway in the breeze and thought of all the nights he had ridden through storms, chasing debts that weren't his. Now there was nothing left to chase, only home, not a place, but a peace. When the last light faded, he reached for Clara's hand, roughened from work, warm from life. The silver at her wrist shimmered faintly, like starlight caught in motion. Around them, the valley breathed, slow, sure, alive again. The war, the lies, the debts, all seemed to dissolve into that single, steady rhythm of peace. And if heaven had eyes that night, it might have looked down and understood that redemption isn't a thunderclap or a crown. It's the soft sound of two hands finding each other in the quiet, after all the noise is gone. Sometimes the world feels like a marketplace, where hearts are traded and mercy costs more than gold. But every once in a while, someone reminds us that kindness doesn't need a witness, only courage. It can be quiet, it can be small, yet it changes everything, like a hand reaching through the dust to lift another from despair. Perhaps that's what this story truly whispers to us, that love isn't measured by what we have, but by what we're willing to give up. And that redemption doesn't arrive in grand gestures, but in the soft moments, when we choose compassion over pride and silence over cruelty. If you've ever felt the weight of doing the right thing, even when no one's watching, then maybe, in some way, this story was yours too. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this still stir something gentle inside you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next light that flickers through the dark. May you find peace in small mercies, and may kindness always find its way back to you.